Good to meet on this very important topic at a critical juncture in the attempt to um, reboot the education systems and repair some of the damage done by the school closures due to COVID-19. As we all know, by the spring of this year, most school systems around the world had to be closed because of the health issues due to the pandemic and safety of children and their families. According to UNESCO, more than 1.5, 1.6 billion students at one time were out of school. So the biggest event, certainly in our lifetimes, to affect education worldwide. We know from past episodes, past pandemics, that these have tremendous economic and social effects. Black Death back in the 14th century, 75 million dead, and of course an impact on labor markets with a tremendous reduction of labor, especially in urban areas, but the higher agricultural wages. Spanish flu, a bit more recently, more than 100 million dead, and several impacts on social and economic outputs. In fact, research published just before COVID-19 pandemic began showed that even up until the 1980s, those children that were born during or were in utero during the Spanish flu suffered social and socioeconomic effects, including lower levels of education, lower income. So pandemics affect economic output in the current year, as we know, but also have a long-term effect on social and economic development. Income is one area. We've already seen estimates of the loss of GDP this year. And what I wanted to share today is that the impacts on national income as a result of lost learning are likely to be with us for a long time and will be larger in impact than current year income losses. The way that we categorize the costs of the school closures, there are two main categories. One is the learning loss. If people aren't in school, then presumably they're missing out on their education. And all of us here today, I'm sure, believe that education and the presence of children in the classroom does lead to learning gains. So therefore, by definition, less access to schooling should reduce learning, unfortunately. And the other longer term impact is what happens when these students, these children and youth enter the labor market with the lost education. What happens to them in terms of the jobs they get, the earnings that they will generate. We've already seen many predictions, simulations, and modeling of the potential impact of the school closures on the education system. The World Bank published in the summer its projections of what the school closures would mean in terms of lost learning and proficiency levels, and taking different scenarios, optimistic to pessimistic, meaning large impacts or relatively small ones. And even in the most optimistic scenarios, a learning loss was expected, and an increase in those students falling below the minimum proficiency level, which, according to PISA, the OECD, these minimum levels are effectively functional illiteracy. So these are disturbing numbers, even if only the optimistic scenario was to be realized. And as we've seen, even when these projections were made, the estimates then were about maybe a 4-month school closure. We've seen longer school closures in many systems around the world. For Europe and Central Asia, our estimates suggest significant learning losses, even in the optimistic scenario of at least a 3% loss in terms of learning adjusted years of schooling, a measure that takes into consideration lost schooling in terms of quantity you have 4 or 5 months less schooling, and how much learning you lose in terms of what you can do as measured in cognitive tests. So losing up to a year of education as a result of the school closures. One might say, how could you lose a year when the schools were only closed for 4 or 5 months? And the answer is it's a combined effect of the cognitive learning loss and the years of education. Both have an impact on ultimate learning attainment. And for at least the Northern Hemisphere countries, the school closures coincided with the spring breaks in some countries and then summer breaks for all countries. And we know that the summers are associated also with learning losses as well. The average scores are likely to go down from about 460 in Europe to up to 430, so almost 30 points. Really, almost a year's worth of learning could be lost as a result of the crisis. Again, these are predictions, and I'll come to what we're actually finding in the world. Now, the way to mitigate these learning losses, of course, is to do what every country did and to put in place its distance education system. Some have referred to the efforts as really emergency remote teaching because no country was prepared for massive school closures that would result in all of their students from pre-kindergarten to university to be out of school. And in most countries, there is a limited capacity to put in motion a distance education system that would be available to all. We do expect weak student connectivity in at least some parts of every country. And given the lack of connectivity in some countries, there were efforts to extend learning through television. We have countries that use radio. We have countries that use the postal service to keep learning continuity. And of course, these methods reduce the level of interaction between teacher and student and therefore affect the quality of education. The reports early on from the highest income countries were of relatively poor attendance to the distance education classes. Large levels in some large cities in North America, Europe, and the like, particularly of high school students that just were not interested in the type of education that's going on. So all these factors tend to blunt the effect of the mitigation efforts. And I would say that governments made very strong, heroic efforts to provide learning continuity. It's just that no one was prepared for massive schooling closures. So there's been several estimates of the economic costs, predicting using past crises as examples or modeling the system. Probably the first one that I saw was in Norway that suggested large learning losses that would extend as the closures continued. U.S. there are several indicators suggesting that, especially those in higher education, could lose up to $80,000 as a result of 4 months of school closures. The estimates, of course, varied by the level of education, but at least a 9 to 10% reduction in future earnings. Studies in the UK suggesting that each month of school closures would reduce earnings by about 3% a year. The estimates in Canada suggest that if unemployment levels increase, there will be a significant loss of maybe 20% earnings for those students entering the labor market during the crisis induced by COVID. Global estimates we discussed, and the World Bank's estimate is that in terms of lost lifetime earnings for students as a result of the school closures could be $10 trillion over a long period of time. So large impacts from a variety of countries and global estimates from the bank. Our estimate extended the World Bank analysis to bring in higher education. The estimate I mentioned of $10 trillion was only for primary and secondary education. Our estimates include higher education, more difficult to do. We don't have a test, so these are actually underestimates of the potential loss of future GDP as a result of the school closure. So when we bring in higher education, it could be 12 to 18% of future GDP, much larger number than others have been showing. We also estimate the impacts by income level of the country, and for individuals, the present value loss of learning are about $2,000 over a lifetime. It doesn't sound like a lot of money, but keep in mind these are low-income countries, and $2,000 could be quite devastating for the individuals and their families. The estimates rise to 6,700 and 21,000 in high-income countries, and at the global level, it's about $11,000. So that doesn't sound like very much given the kinds of numbers we talk about globally. But remember, there are 1.5 billion students affected by the school closure. When we multiply these, we get much larger numbers. The global impact could be $11 trillion over the lifetime of these 1.5 billion students. And these estimates, of course, are assuming a 4-month school closure, and we know some countries it was longer than 4 months. So again, these are conservative estimates. The number sounds small in low-income countries, but given the level of income in low-income countries, this is a devastating number. The largest losses are for middle-income countries at 6.8 trillion. That's because most students in the world are in a middle-income country. So that's where we're likely to see the biggest impacts, but the global impacts are large. Looking at the losses by level of education, two facts come out. Of course, earnings are higher at the tertiary level, so those losses could be much higher at the tertiary level, but the losses at the primary and secondary level are also high when you keep in mind the potential earnings of students with only a primary or secondary education. We also know from crises that those with tertiary education can protect themselves from either from job loss or from total income losses. And we've seen larger losses in crises for those with secondary education and below. So we expect a distributional effect that will favor those with tertiary education and will favor those from higher socioeconomic background. By definition, then those with less than tertiary and those from poor socioeconomic backgrounds will suffer more, as has been the case in past crises that we've seen. So we do expect a differentiated effect, primarily because educational attainment increases cognitive skills, and those with much higher levels of education, higher cognitive skills, could suffer less, and those who are more educated are better able to cope, both because employers may be reluctant to let go of highly skilled, prepared workers, and might be more likely to dismiss those with lower levels of education. So again, we see a potential response that would favor those with higher levels of education. Also, those with higher levels of schooling may have information channels that will allow them to move within jobs, within, say, the enterprise, or change jobs and be more protected. So we do expect a differentiated effect. How do we know that? I'll come to this in a moment. We also know from past crises that the returns to education, the relative pay of those with more and less education, let's say those with university versus secondary, this tends to increase during crises. Argentina, with several periods of economic crises, and we're expecting a recession of as large or larger proportions to come. So in Argentina, we know that as incomes overall plummeted, the relative pay between those with higher education secondary actually increased. So favors those with higher levels of education. We saw the same thing in Mexico. During crises, there seemed to be a growth in the pay premium to those with higher education, and this continued into the future. Same pattern in Venezuela, many different crises over time, but the relative pay of those with university versus secondary tends to remain high and actually increased in the latest crisis. We saw the same pattern in Greece, very important study by Holezas and others showing that as overall national income levels decreased significantly, the relative pay of those with higher levels of schooling tended to increase slightly over time and has been maintained ever since. So the advantages occur during the crisis, but they tend to remain after crisis. And just to make the point that it is a loss of earnings of those with secondary and below, the case of Argentina is shown again, but here you can see the growth of the returns to tertiary education compared to what's happening for secondary education. The drop is at the secondary level, and this tends to give a higher return to those with higher education. Doesn't mean they're earning more during the crisis, it just means that relative earnings are higher for those with university education. And this points to a potential problem even post-COVID recession, that inequality may increase significantly. And we're coming to the point where, for the first time in history, education will actually contribute to growing inequality rather than contributing to equity. So we know in Europe, there's been several attempts to study what's actually happened, because until now I've talked about predictions and theory, but we do have some evidence coming in. We know from the countries where I work in Europe and Central Asia, there have been tremendous efforts to extend distance education. We also get reports that some students are left out because of the lack of access to the internet, lack of access to digital equipment. Countries have made efforts by providing education via broadcast television. I mentioned also radio has been used, and in some cases in remote areas, the postal system. But we are seeing evidence now, and it's come from representative studies in Germany and Switzerland to show that the significant reduction in time devoted to study during the lockdown. So even though the students are connected, there are lessons being broadcast, internet and television, students are spending less time studying. We have received also the first signs of learning loss from actual surveys that compare students just before the crisis and now that the schools have reopened. In Belgium, we saw a significant decline in learning levels. We also saw a significant decline in learning levels in the Netherlands. Much smaller in the Netherlands, but it was a shorter lockdown period in the Netherlands. So the learning losses are pretty much what was predicted by the World Bank in terms of absolute levels. What we didn't know is how devastating this is for poorer segments of society. So in both Netherlands and Belgium, much larger learning losses for those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. A similar study in the UK showed that students are much less prepared than they were a year ago, and part of this is due to the crisis as well. And just last week from the United States, from the city of Dallas in Texas, learning losses of about affecting 30% of the population. So the evidence suggests that those predictions are falling more in the pessimistic side of what the World Bank predicted. So we're seeing learning losses, we're seeing large learning losses, significant learning losses, and much larger for those from poor socioeconomic backgrounds, just to repeat the point. And we expect this to come out in studies that we know are coming from middle-income countries and from some lower-income countries. More data will come in. It would be surprising not to see significant learning losses. So we're seeing less schooling, less effort taking place, and now significant learning losses from several countries in Europe, and now for the first time from the United States. So what can we do about this? Distance education is definitely part of the solution, but it's not enough. I think the systems have been put in place in some countries that have either continued an online presence or a mixed presence have improved. So we do need to build the capacity of the distance education system. But what do you do about the students that have lost learning? There is hope from some studies showing that high dosage tutoring, as it's called in the United States, many rigorous studies have taken place to show that this can help reduce learning losses and help students catch up to where they should be. So tutoring has been put in place in several countries. The literature suggests this is a promising intervention. The other is to use assessments to inform teachers on how they can improve learning outcomes and address the learning losses for those students that have fallen further behind. But we need information, and we need the information to get to teachers at the front lines. An effective response would require connectivity, both emergency and to improve the IT infrastructure, production of high quality digital content to go along with the efforts that are taking place. And we've seen in most countries the need to build the institutional capacity that will provide the response during the closures, but also in the recovery, and to build a system that's resilient to the kinds of events that may take place again in the future. Thank you very much.